My name is Sharon Welsh, and I've had the bounty of working with Mary Wynne, Sheila, and a few others studying global governance over the past year. When I started, I knew very little about the United Nations and had only a surface understanding of the Baha'i writings on peace and global governance. I feel like I've just dipped my toe in and am just beginning to understand global governance and how much the world needs a reformed United Nations. Baha'u'llah, Abdul-Baha, Shoghi Effendi, and the Universal House of Justice have all dedicated tablets, letters, books, and messages to the topic of peace. The need for a global governance with high ideals, clear laws, and the power to enforce are found throughout all of the writings. I want to start by looking at a quote from Abdul-Baha's first tablet to The Hague, because I think you will see the recommendations found in this quote reflected in the proposals I will be sharing from the book. It's a long tablet, and so I've tried to pull out some of the relevant content. The full quote can be found in your handout. The choices of each nation to represent it. They should be well informed concerning international laws and the relations between governments, and aware of the essential needs of the world of humanity. The number is to be in proportion to the number of inhabitants of that country, and they would be elected by their citizens and confirmed by their governments. From among these peoples, the members of the Supreme Tribunal will be elected. And when the Supreme Tribunal gives a ruling on any international question, it is binding. And if any government or nation does not obey a decision of the Supreme Tribunal, the rest of the nations will rise up against it. Earlier, Mary Wynne showed you this diagram of the original proposal for the UN, where the General Assembly is the center of power and the Security Council under its purview. The plan was for weighted representation based on a nation's population and GDP, majority vote, so no veto, universal jurisdiction, which is the right to make laws that would apply to all member states, and a world court with the ability to enforce its rulings. Unfortunately, this has not yet been put into place. As this slide shows, what we got is quite different, and the changes had enormous consequences. They really weakened the United Nations and its ability to serve the common good. The Security Council has all the power and authority. When you combine this with all 5 permanent members, that's China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, having the right of veto, you have a system that has really hampered the UN's ability to address often critical and life-threatening situations. The result has been more than 200 armed conflicts with tens of millions of people having died. Reform is critically needed if the UN is going to be able to serve humanity and provide for its security. The good news is that we have the opportunity to change the United Nations using the possibilities provided in the Charter. In the book, the authors prefer the option of reforming and strengthening the United Nations, but recognize the option of replacing the UN with another structure. The Security Council veto is seen as the fatal flaw in the structure of the United Nations. The rivalry between those with veto power have frequently paralyzed the Security Council. Countries have used the veto in their best interest to destabilize others and to avoid criticism or accountability. The UN Charter and the work of the UN involves encouraging and supporting democratic principles and working for the best interest of humanity. Giving 5 countries the power to paralyze the UN's ability to respond to often urgent and life-threatening situations is in conflict with this. This privileged status for a few has eroded the legitimacy and weakened our trust in the United Nations. As the Security Council's main role involves the maintenance of peace and security, this has allowed too many conflicts to flourish and undermined the international rule of law. In a governance befitting, the Baha'i International Community wrote in 2020 that reforming the overall infrastructure for promoting and sustaining peace, including reform of the Security Council itself, would enable familiar patterns of paralysis and deadlock to give way to a more decisive response to the threat of conflict. The authors recommend that the Security Council be replaced with an Executive Council to be comprised of 24 members and operate under the General Assembly with a larger focus on general management of operations. The permanent member status would be eliminated and members chosen using the same formula of representation as the General Assembly. And most obviously, they recommend replacing the veto with a 2/3 majority vote. Resistance to change by permanent members of the Security Council will likely continue to be a stumbling block of reform. The authors have put forward several possible legal routes within the existing charter, and if all else fails, a successor organization may be necessary. There are also a number of challenges within the General Assembly itself. Currently, they have no legislative authority. As Mary Wynne said, it truly is amazing what they have accomplished with only the ability to propose, suggest, and encourage, and no legal authority at all. They also have a one country, one vote system, which is seen by many as unfair and undemocratic. There is a situation where Liechtenstein, with a population of 38,000, has the same vote as China, with over 1 billion people. Members of the General Assembly are diplomats representing their country, yet the first words of the UN Charter are, "We the people." On this slide, you'll see some of the changes that have been put forward. One country, one vote changes to weighted voting that uses a mathematical average of 3 factors: population, gross domestic product, and a membership share that is the same for all countries, 1/193rd. Lack of authority is addressed with greater powers to legislate. The authors envision the General Assembly as the main seat of power in the reformed UN to eventually have binding legislation and the ability to enforce its laws. With these measures in place, the threat of interstate war will gradually fade and be replaced by a new wave of positive effort to build a more cooperative international order. The authors recommend that membership of the General Assembly be changed from diplomats to citizens. The shift to greater citizen involvement could happen fairly quickly, and this might also help to mobilize other changes. They present 2 possible options for moving in this direction. The first is a gradual introduction of a full popular vote of citizens, but they suggest that the timeline for doing this is too long and the situation is too urgent. The second option is to establish an interim United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. The United Nations Parliamentary Assembly would be an advisory body to the General Assembly to act as the voice of citizens, to advise on world problems, and to act as a catalyst for reform. They would focus on humanity's better interest versus narrow national considerations, and in time, this assembly could be granted greater powers. And the best news, creating the United Nations Parliamentary Assembly can be done within the Charter as it exists. It does not require the agreement of the Security Council. There is already significant support for a UN Parliamentary Assembly from many groups, including the EU and Canada. So this brings us to another very important area of reform, the role of peacekeeping. The idea for an international peace force is not new. Over 100 years ago, the creation of an international military force for the League of Nations was discussed. At the formation of the UN, there were plans to have members of the UN make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, facilities, and other supports to ensure the maintenance of international peace and security. These plans were not completed at the San Francisco Conference in 1945, and it was to be the responsibility of the Security Council to lead and facilitate the negotiations of these agreements, and they were to do it as soon as possible. Unfortunately, it was never done, and this has left one of the most important innovations of the United Nations Charter unrealized. The proposal is for all countries to yield sovereignty to a single international peace force, and that national militaries will be limited to only what is needed internally. The authors are recommending a standing force of 800,000 trained troops. The projected cost is $150 billion US, which is actually pretty small when considering the current world military spending is very close to $2 trillion annually. I would like to end with a quote from A Governance Befitting. The range of areas in which established systems and approaches are in need of radical transformation suggests how critical the coming quarter of a century will be in determining the fortunes of humanity.